Well, hello everybody. Welcome to another video on the History Valley podcast, and today I'm joined by Professor Bartosz Adamczewski. And today's discussion is based on his book, The Gospel of the Narrative Way, the hypertextual relationship of the fourth gospel to the Acts of the Apostles. But we will also be discussing a little bit about John using the Synoptic Gospels as well, and not necessarily just John's use of Acts. So with that being said, Bartosz, thank you very much for joining me today.
It's good to see you again on this channel. And also warm greetings to all our listeners and viewers who have been listening to us and watching us for a couple of times already. The topic is very interesting, in fact. I think that it's very much discussed. First, scholars have been discussing the issue of John's relationship with the other Gospels, with the three preceding Gospels, the so-called Synoptic Gospels. And the issue has been discussed since antiquity, in fact, since the fathers of the Church. Irenaeus, for example, regarded all four Gospels as, in fact, one fourfold Gospel, whereas Clement of Alexandria divided them into two groups, the bodily Gospels and the spiritual Gospel. The fourth Gospel is the spiritual one, the pneumatikon. So the issue is almost as old as Christianity. And it's no wonder that also our generation joins this discussion on the relationship between the fourth Gospel and the three Synoptic Gospels. For me, the issue is interesting because in my idea, in my hypothesis, the fourth Gospel is not only dependent on the three Synoptic Gospels, Mark, Luke, and Matthew, in this order, chronological order, as I and a couple of scholars also regard them, first Mark, then Luke, and then Matthew, but also on the second part of the Lucan work, namely the Acts of the Apostles. In fact, many scholars tentatively, at least, hypothesize that John used at least the Gospel of Mark and also, especially, the Gospel of Luke. It is James Barker who recently argued for John's dependence on the Gospel of Matthew. But scholars, if they tend to reckon with the possibility of John's use of the synoptic Gospels, they usually think of the Gospel of Mark and maybe especially the Gospel of Luke, because there are some similarities which are closer between the Gospel of John and the Gospel of Luke. For me, the question is, if John knew and used the Gospel of Luke, how is it possible that he did not know and use the Acts of the Apostles, the second part of the Lucan work? For me, it's not logical, in fact. If we reckon with the possibility of John's use of the Gospel of Luke, then also of the Acts of the Apostles. And this is my idea, and this is the difference between me, myself, and other scholars, who very rarely discuss the possibility of John's use of the Acts of the Apostles. And for me, this is the crucial hypothesis for the understanding of the fourth Gospel. Because the fourth Gospel begins with the famous prologue, which centers on Logos. And we have a similar idea in the Acts of the Apostles. Ton men proton logon epoiesamen kratis theophila. So the Gospel of John begins in the same way, in the thematic way. The prologue, elaborate prologue of John, is an allusion to the elaborate prologue in the Gospel of Luke and also in the Acts of the Apostles. And the mention, the remark concerning Logos, in fact, alludes to the Logos in the prologue to the Acts of the Apostles. And what is important is the order of ideas, which is similar in the fourth Gospel and in the Acts of the Apostles. Of course, the narrative thread is very different. Here we have the stories of the Apostles, especially Peter and Paul, and then we have the story of Jesus. Nevertheless, the topics, the motifs are very similar. For example, if we consider the male-female pattern in the Gospel of John, first the Nicodemus coming to Jesus at night, and then the Samaritan woman. The male-female pattern, in fact, is distinctively Lucan. And this is an illustration of the characters who come to the apostles, namely first Gamaliel, and then the evangelization in Samaria, and the Simon the Samaritan who comes to Philip. So we have similar ideas, and then we have the Basilicus, the royal official in the Gospel of John, and a similar royal official in the Acts of Apostles, in Acts 8. So the order of stories, of common motifs, is the same in the fourth Gospel and in the Acts of Apostles. Moreover, there are distinctively Lucan ideas that are contained in the Gospel of John. I already mentioned the typical Lucan male-female pattern. In Paul's letters, it's almost no difference, the order between the man and the woman. Paul is very egalitarian in this respect. Whereas for Luke, it's almost, with the exception for Mary, it's always the man and the woman following. And we have the same pattern, for example, with the characters of Nicodemus and the Samaritan woman. What is distinctive of the Lucan traits in the Gospel of John is first the elaborate prologue, alluding to a previous writing. As I said, it's Luke who is famous for his prologues in the New Testament. And we also have traits of echoes of these prologues in the epistles of the Hebrews and also in the Gospel of John. But this is a Lucan idea, to begin a work with the prologue. If we consider the Gospel of Mark and also the Gospel of Matthew, we have nothing like this. It's Luke who invented, so to say, who created such elaborate prologues to his works, and John borrows this idea from the Lucan double work. Moreover, the idea of Jesus' ascension to heaven, it's typically Lucan. We have nothing like this. In fact, in the letters of Paul, this is a typically Lucan narrative scene, and we have an allusion to it at the end of the fourth Gospel. Moreover, the idea of evangelization as bearing witness to Jesus. I recently wrote an article about it. It's a typically Lucan idea. In Paul's letters, we have the notion of witness, but it functions in a very different way. In fact, it was Luke who invented, so to say, the idea of witness, giving witness, bearing witness to Jesus, as a means for explaining what evangelization means. And John borrowed this idea from the Lucan work, especially from the Acts of Apostles. Then, what is very interesting, especially to me, is the idea of the geographical pattern. In the Gospel of Mark, we have the pattern of first Galilee and then Judea. It's very simple. Jesus starts his activity begins his activity in Galilee, and then decides to go to Judea, and then passes to Judea, and then ends in Jerusalem. Whereas in the Acts of Apostles, the pattern is very different. We have Jerusalem as a center, the new center of Christianity, and from this center, there are missionary journeys to this world. First to the Jews, then to the Gentiles, and then to the church with its problems. We have the so-called missionary journeys of Paul from Jerusalem to the world. And John borrows this geographical pattern, which is non-Markan at all, to his gospel. In his gospel, strangely, surprisingly, Jesus is at home not in Galilee, not in Capernaum. He's at home in Judea. This is his home, and we have it in John chapter 1. And from the center, from Jerusalem, he makes excursions, so to say. He makes journeys to Galilee and back. He's in a hurry because he must come back for a Jewish festival back to Jerusalem. So he's at home in Jerusalem, and from this center he makes missionary journeys, so to say, to Galilee. So this pattern in the Gospel of John is very different from that of the Gospel of Mark. So John must have known the Acts of the Apostles to make such a reworking of the Markan pattern. Otherwise, it's unexplainable why John uses such a different pattern from that of Mark. In fact, in my opinion, this pattern is much closer to history. In fact, Jesus was mainly active in Jerusalem, and the idea of his activity is in Galilee is in fact typically Markan. Every time Paul comes to Jerusalem, he meets there the apostles. They simply live there. They are at home there in Jerusalem. So this Johannine pattern is in fact much closer to history, but it's borrowed from the Acts of the Apostles. Moreover, the idea of mission in Samaria. We have nothing like this in the Gospel of Mark. In Matthew, Jesus must avoid Samaria, so to say. But it's the Lucan pattern of the mission to Samaria, because Luke is interested in Samaria as an intermediate stage, so to say, between Judea and the Gentiles. So we have the Samaritans, who are the rest of Israel, and they are the intermediate stage in the propagation of the gospel between Judea and the Gentiles. So Luke is interested in the mission in Samaria for theological reasons. And John simply borrows this Lucan pattern, borrowed from the Acts of the Apostles, to his gospel. And that is why we have the Samaritan woman, the long dialogue with the Samaritan woman. Otherwise, there's nothing to do, to search, so to say, in Samaria for Jesus. Moreover, we have Ephraim, a village called Ephraim. Strange village, because we have no village of this name mentioned in sources. In fact, this is an allusion to the tribe of Ephraim, the Samaritan tribe. So John is interested in the mission to Samaria, and this is another Lucan idea borrowed from the Acts of the Apostles. Another distinctively Lucan idea is the idea of remaining of Jesus and the 12 within the land of Israel. This is a Lucan idea, because Luke likes order, taxis, and he orders everything katataxing, according to the order. And that is why for him, Jesus and the 12 should remain within the land of Israel, and it will be Paul and Barnabas who will go to the world. In contrast to the later church traditions, the apostles should not go to India, to Egypt, to Armenia, and to other countries. They should remain within the land of Israel. This is a Lucan idea, and John borrows this idea. His Jesus does not leave Judea, the land of Israel. He remains within the land of Israel. Another distinctively Lucan idea in the Gospel of John is the idea of the high social dignity of the main hero. It is typically Lucan, because Luke wanted to present the early church, early Christianity, as not a religion of slaves, as Marx called it, but as a religion of people of high social rank. He was interested and presented Paul as a very educated person, very respected person. Everyone respected Paul. And Jesus is shown in the same way in the fourth gospel. Everyone respects Jesus. Even Pilate respects Jesus. They are on par. They are on the same level, so to say. They may make a philosophical discussion between each other without any distinction of the social level between the two. Another idea, another typical Lucan idea, is the idea of the hostility of the Jews. Called in this way, the Jews are the main opponents of the gospel, of the propagation of the gospel in the Acts of the Apostles, and John borrows this idea. That is why he is accused of anti-Semitism, because he repeatedly uses the idea of the Jews as the main opponents of the gospel. Not the Pharisees, not the Herodians, but the Jews called in this way. This is another Lucan idea, and also the idea of the expulsion from the synagogue. We find it in Acts, and we find it in the fourth gospel. Another idea, which is I like it very much, is the idea of the prolonged interrogation of Jesus, of the main character by the Jews and especially by the Roman government. We have this prolonged interrogation and discussion in the Acts of Apostles, which again shows the high dignity of Paul because he is interrogated by the Roman governor of Judea. And the same occurs in the fourth gospel. Jesus is interrogated by the Roman governor, and they make a good discussion, a prolonged discussion between each other. And the final idea is the idea of the open ending, the famous open ending of the Acts of Apostles. We have the same similar open ending in the fourth gospel, the idea of the free, unrestricted propagation of the gospel in the whole world. And John says that it may be many books which will be necessary for describing this gospel, but in fact we have the whole world which will not contain them. So the idea of the whole world as a stage for the propagation of the gospel, not just the Jews, not just Judea and so on, but the whole world. So this is the open ending of the Acts of Apostles, which is reworked at the end of the fourth gospel. So we have many Lucan traits which are borrowed and reworked in the fourth gospel, which show that the fourth gospel is not an independent narrative. It contains so many Lucan ideas which explain the particular features of the fourth gospel. They explain many otherwise many features which are otherwise difficult to explain. Consider, for example, the cleansing of the temple. In the Gospel of Mark, it is placed at the end of a story, at the end of a narrative. And it's logical, because if Jesus attacked, so to say, the money making in the temple, then his end was quite close. Whereas in the fourth gospel, the cleansing of the temple is placed at the beginning of this activity, which is strange, because after this event, he would be arrested immediately by the high priest. So in historical terms, it's inconceivable. But this is a reworking of the temple episode in the Acts of the Apostles, which occurs at the beginning of the story. So we have here a pattern which explains the features of the fourth gospel. Or, for example, the final story, the maritime story. Many scholars, especially trained in the so-called form of Christicism, regard the final chapter of the fourth gospel, John 21, as an independent story, which was later appended, so to say, later added to the main narrative. So scholars hypothesize that maybe this is a later narrative written by someone else, and it was he was interested in church issues, and that is why it was added to the main story of the fourth gospel by someone else, and so on and so on. Whereas this narrative is, again, it's typical Lucan. We have this narrative in Luke 5, and it's an integral part of the story of the fourth gospel, because it illustrates the maritime story at the end of the Acts of Apostles. We have the same pattern of landing on the shore and the seashore, and idealos, which means the sand, and the fire, which was kindled there. We have the same motifs, even the same words used in the story of the Acts of Apostles, and also at the end of the fourth gospel. Moreover, finally, I was able to explain the strange number of fish, 153. Scholars for centuries debated what was the meaning of this strange number. If it were 120, it would be easy. If it were 144, it would be easy to explain. 200 would be easy to explain, but why 153? In fact, this is a triangular number, which means that it's a result of an addition of 1 plus 2 plus 3 plus 4 plus 5 and so on, up to 17, which make 153. And this is a hint or allusion to another triangular number, which is used in the same part of the story, in the maritime final story in the Acts of the Apostles, where we have 276 people on board of the ship. And all of them were saved because of Paul. So they are the fish. If we remember the story of the miracle of catch of fish, we are called to go to this world and catch fish, which means people, humans. How many humans? 276, a triangular number of the ship, and 153 in the story of the fourth gospel. So finally, I was able to explain this mysterious number. Why did John use a triangular number in his novel? So many features are explained in my theory, in my hypothesis of John's use of not only the Synoptic Gospels, but also the Acts of the Apostles.
What is your take on the beloved disciple in the Gospel of John?
I think, and in fact, already scholars in antiquity had this idea that this disciple is not one of the 12. He does not belong to the group of the 12, and it's visible especially in the final chapter of John's story of the story of the fourth gospel that he's not one of the 12. He's a different kind of disciple, not just a 13th disciple. He's a different kind of disciple who relies on faith and not on bodily touching the risen Jesus. We have this in John chapter 20, in which he can see and believe, in contrast to Peter, who must touch, so to say, the remnants, the physical remnants of the risen Jesus. So his contact with the risen Jesus is different by means of faith. And we know who was the character, who was the person in the early church who mainly relied on faith. It was Paul, of course. So the beloved disciple, in fact, is an allusion to all the disciples come to the gospel stories, who come to the gospel story via or by mediation, so to say, of Paul the Apostle. Another kind of disciples, a different kind of disciples, who do not have, so to say, the physical contact with Jesus. They rather rely on faith and love. He is the closest disciple. He is closest to Jesus. He runs faster than Peter. Again, in this challenge, so to say, you remember 1 Corinthians 15, in which Paul says that he was the last one, the aborted one. But when it came to work, he was the first one. and we have the same presentation of the beloved disciple here in the fourth gospel. So I think that here we have a window, so to say, in the gospel story that the 12 are not the whole world, that there are other means of approaching Jesus than simply being Peter or Thomas or other disciples who belong to the group of the 12. And I think that we are, in fact, in the position of the beloved disciple. We do not have physical access to the risen Jesus, but we have access to him by faith.
So you see some parallels, as I think you were just saying, you see some parallels between the beloved disciple and the way Paul is described in Acts.
Yes, but the main parallelism is between the Johannine Jesus and Paul the Apostle. So it's not the beloved disciple, but in fact the character of Jesus as he is presented here. He, with his high social dignity and so on and so on, he corresponds to the character of Paul in the Acts of the Apostles. So the beloved disciple is important on the narrative level within the story of the fourth gospel. But if we take the intertextual relationship between the fourth gospel and the Acts of the Apostles, then we have the character of Jesus, who is described in distinctively Lucan terms, as Luke described Paul the Apostle.
So is the beloved disciple based on an anonymous historical figure, or is the beloved disciple a fictional Johannine invention?
So I would say that he's not fictional in the sense that he was not invented. I think if we consider Josephus, for example, the core of the so-called testimony of Levine shows that there were also other people, even Gentiles, who approached the historical Jesus as he was described by Josephus. So I think that Jesus was open to the contact with various people, even Gentiles. So I wouldn't say that the beloved disciple, who represents a different kind of disciples, is totally invented. He has no name, which is also important in narrative terms. Almost all other characters have some names. Even Nicodemus and the Samaritan woman has no name, for example. But all other characters have some name. Whereas here we have no name consciously, because we can identify with this character. And you and me, Jacob, Bartosz, we can identify with this character. So I wouldn't say that the character is invented, but the theological traits which are given to this character make him accessible to us all during centuries and in all countries of the world.
Do you have an opinion on who the beloved disciple might be? Because I know that the church fathers that talk about him seem to think it's John the Apostle. If you have an opinion on the identity, who do you think this person might be, if it's even possible to even know?
If we read the final chapter of the fourth gospel, then we can see the miraculous catch of fish, in which there are the sons of Zebedee mentioned, and at the end there are some other disciples, and it seems that the beloved disciple is one of them. So the final chapter of John's story shows, maybe not demonstrates, but shows that the author of the fourth gospel did not consider the beloved disciple as identical to one of the 12, especially to son of Zebedee, John, son of Zebedee. Because on the narrative level of the fourth gospel, they function differently. As I said, in this final story, there are 7 disciples. 2 of them are sons of Zebedee, and 2 of them are anonymous disciples. And it seems that the beloved disciple is one of the latter ones. So I don't think that the author of the Gospel of John would identify the beloved disciple with John, son of Zebedee. It's a theory which was made by the church fathers to explain the mysterious, enigmatic character of the beloved disciple. Moreover, as I said, the fact that he has no name is important. It is not by oblivion that the author did not mention his name. The character of the beloved disciple functions differently than, for example, Thomas. Even Thomas has a name in this story, but the beloved disciple does not. And this is important.
So you would take it to say that the fact that this character isn't named is a strong indication that trying to figure out who he is isn't going to get anyone anywhere, because the point is for the character to not have a name, and that character, by not having a name, is distinguished from everyone else mentioned in the Gospels.
Yes, especially from the 12 who have their names. If John wanted to mention the beloved disciple with or identify him with John, he would have given him the name of John, but he did not, for purpose. And that is why I think that for the author of the fourth gospel, the beloved disciple is not equal to John, son of Zebedee. And the last chapter, especially the last chapter, shows that among the 7 disciples present at the miraculous catch of fish, the sons of Zebedee are different from the anonymous disciples.
Previously, I've asked you in a previous recording a while back, is John chapter 21, an addition to John's Gospel because, as you know, several scholars think it's a later addition at that originally it ended in chapter 20. Could you give us a brief recap on your view? Was it a later addition or was it part of the original text?
Yes, I already talked about it. Many scholars regard the final chapter as a later addition, but in my hypothesis, if John is a reworking of the Acts of the Apostles, then the final part of the Acts of the Apostles is a maritime story, the sea journey, and the saving of 276 Gentiles on the ship. And we have an echo, intertextual allusion to this story in the Acts of the Apostles in the last chapter of the fourth Gospel. And that is why I think that the last chapter is an integral part of the narrative of the fourth Gospel. It's not a later addition. If the vocabulary is different, it's because the topic is different. The sea journey requires other vocabulary than the land's wandering of Jesus here and there from Judea to Galilee and back to Judea. And that is why the vocabulary is different. Nevertheless, we have something like this in the Acts of Apostles, the story of the miraculous catch of fish, so to say, the catch of the 276 people on board who are saved because of Paul. And he has such a voice from heaven that they will be saved because of him. So they are caught by him, so to say, by Paul, not simply by chance, by miraculous weather change, but because of Paul. And Paul caught them, so to say, not to make them disciples. Nevertheless, he caught them in a kind of net. He shared bread with them. We have a kind of Eucharist on board of the ship, and so on and so on. And something like this can also be found in the fourth Gospel. And that's why I strongly disagree with all scholars who are trained in form criticism. And this is, alas, this is a pity, because scholars tend to find sources where there are no sources. There's an integral narrative. Simply because they are trained in form criticism, they want to look for sources, even if they do not exist in the data that we have. No manuscript contains the fourth Gospel without the final chapter. So,
and to that end, there are of course Johannine scholars that see the text of John developing over time with like, okay, you got a version of John over here, Proto John, with a couple of chapters, and this one adds a few more, and this one adds a few more, and this one adds a few more, and then it gets put all together by a final redactor. Because they think that they're seeing breaks in the text. So do you think that some of these so-called literary breaks, or the styles diverging, in other words, could some of that be explained also in the same way that you use Acts to explain John 21? Could it be because John's using it's because John's using Acts in Luke, so sometimes the style in John changes because he's using another source that we already have?
yes, and I think that this is my main input into scholarship,
Yeah.
into research on the fourth Gospel, because there are many literary inconsistencies in the fourth Gospel which are very difficult to explain. You may also invent some sources and say that we have a change of sources here, but in fact, I can explain these literary tensions by recourse to the Acts of the Apostles. For example, the literary break, so to say, between chapter 13 and 14 in the farewell narrative, in the farewell discourse, in the fourth gospel, which is strange because Jesus says, let's get up and go from here, and then he continues the discourse, which is strange. Normally, we cannot explain it. People invent sources here that he must have used, that the author must have used another source here. But in fact, this is strange. Let's get up and go from here. And then he continues talking as though nothing happened. And I can explain such literary tensions and breaks by my hypothesis of John's relationship, John's dependence on the Acts of the Apostles. In fact, such literary breaks are the main argument for my hypothesis, that I can explain them where other scholars cannot. But here I would advise reading not only the book that you mentioned at the beginning, but also my commentary, hypertextual commentary on the fourth gospel, on the Gospel of John, in which in detail I explain such features of the fourth gospel.
And I will have the link to that book and also the Gospel of the Narrative We as well, both in the description below and in the pinned comment. So click on those links if you want to go buy both of those books.
Maybe
one more thing I want to ask you about. Go ahead.
Just an explanation that the Gospel of the Narrative We is my first attempt to solve the problem, and this idea is further developed in detail with better data, so to say, in my hypertextual commentary on the Gospel of John.
In the Gospel of John, there's a brief mention of Satan possessing Judas Iscariot. We also see that in the Gospel of Luke as well. Would you say that's yet another connection between John and Luke, since that specific verse is not in Mark and Matthew?
Yes, I think so. You mentioned it, and there are many such links, as I said, between the fourth gospel and the Gospel of Luke. I think that such literary motifs have been borrowed by John from Luke's gospel, and I really reckon with them. In fact, for me, what is more important is the pattern, is the order of the stories, because motifs can be borrowed from here and from there. It's not a decisive argument, I would say, because you can always say that John borrowed this motif, maybe not from the Gospel of Luke, but from another source, another tradition, and so on and so on. So this argument is valid, but its quality, so to say, is not very, very, very high. I would say that what is much more important for me is the presence of the typically Lucan theological ideas, like, for example, the evangelization in Samaria, or the geographical pattern of going to Galilee and back to Judea. Then the use of such isolated motifs, which can always be explained by means of saying that maybe John borrowed it from another source.
And one more thing I want to ask you about is that in John, it has the feeding of the 5,000, which is also present in all three of the prior Gospels. Would you say that John omits the feeding of the 4,000 because Luke omits the feeding of the 4,000?
In fact, I don't think so. This is a coincidence, I would say, and this is really interesting. But in fact, what is important for John, in many places, not only in this one, is the following discourse, the elaboration of this scene. So the feeding is, so to say, only the entry to the much more important thing, which will be the discourse, the dialogue of Jesus, the so-called Eucharistic discourse in chapter 6 of his gospel. So I think that this was really important for John, and the way in which he presents the meaning, significance of the feeding of the multitude is here again distinctively Lucan, because which again shows the dependence of John's Gospel on the Acts of the Apostles. Because what is important for John is not so much the feeding itself, but rather the following discourse in which Jesus explains that what is crucial is the chewing of the flesh of Jesus and the drinking of his blood. Both these ideas are stand in contrast, stark contrast with the Jewish ideas, with the Jewish sensitivity. Because if you tell a Jew to chew flesh, in fact, this is cannibalism. Moreover, drinking blood is forbidden in Judaism, because drinking blood is impure. So both these ideas are strongly stand in strong opposition to the Jewish sensitivities and perceptions in this world. That chewing flesh makes you a cannibal, and drinking blood makes you impure. Why is it important for John? Because this is in fact, in this story, this is in fact an allusion to the Cornelius story in the Acts of the Apostles, in which the gospel comes to the first Roman, the Roman centurion, and that is why John needs to explain how is it possible that a Gentile can participate in the Eucharist. And that is why we have the long Eucharistic sermon here, not in the final stage, at the final stage of the gospel, in the final part of the gospel, where it should normally be located, with the institution of the Eucharist during the farewell sermon, in the final part, in Jerusalem. Whereas John relocates the whole problem, so to say, to chapter 6, because we have a similar issue in the Acts of the Apostles in chapter 10, at the beginning of the story, so to say. How is it possible for a Gentile to participate in the Jewish meal? And Acts solves this problem, and John also solves this problem in a similar way, that Gentiles can be admitted to the Eucharist, to chewing flesh and drinking blood in a way which is provocative for the Jews, and they must accept it unless they go away as non-believers. So again, another striking feature of the fourth gospel can be explained by my hypothesis. Why does John relocate the whole Eucharistic motif from the end of the gospel to chapter 6, which is strange here? So I think that we have a solution to this problem here, that what is important for John is not so much a feeding, but rather the question that who can participate in this feeding are the Gentiles, who can chew flesh and drink blood in an impure way, and nevertheless they participate in the Eucharist.
Yeah, I do have one more thing to ask, because I forgot to ask this earlier, and it's about the blind man in John, the healing of the blind man. Because in John, the blind man story is a little closer to Mark in some ways, because both involve the use of spittle. What do you think John was his literary goal here with the blind man story, in your view?
Okay, the blind man here. The blind man, in fact, and the question who is guilty that he is blind. In fact, the answer is that neither he nor his parents, which means that, of course, being blind here is not only physically blind, but being blind, again, means that he cannot see God. And who is guilty that the person cannot see God? He himself or his parents? And John says that neither him nor his parents are guilty, which means that he is a Gentile, in fact, because he cannot see God. And in fact, which is very interesting, the Gentiles are not guilty themselves for the fact that they cannot see God. So he represents all the Gentiles who cannot see God, and the answer is that it is not their fault. It is not their sin, so to say, that they cannot see God. They are all good Greeks, for example, who can come to the gospel story, all good Gentiles, who do not reject the gospel. Their only negative feature is that they are Gentiles, and they are not guilty of this fact. It's not their fault, so to say. This is very important for the Christian theology, because we always have problems with all the non-Christians. How should we perceive them? Are they sinners or not? How should we perceive all non-Christians? Is it their fault, for example, that they are non-Christians? Or what should we do with them? Many people say that they are guilty because they are sinners, because they do not believe in Jesus, they do not believe in God. And the answer in fourth gospel is no, they are not guilty. They should be evangelized, but it does not mean that they are guilty of the fact that they are Gentiles.
And I have to remind everybody that the link to the hypertextual commentary on the Gospel of John and the Gospel of the Narrative of the We will be both in the description below and in the pinned comment just below that. And that being said, thank you very much for joining me today, Bartosz.
Thank you very much for the interesting discussion. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.